Hi, it's Jim Brailer. So many people have asked me about making my bread that thought I'd try to put together a video to kind of show you what I do and what the steps look like that I've described before in my recipe that I had shared. First off, you can use whatever kind of flour you like to use. I typically use a mixture of whole wheat and regular flour, and it looks like I forgot to get the whole wheat, so I'll be right back. Now when I do it, I use about 3/4 of a cup of whole wheat. I don't measure it precisely, I just use a single cup and get a little bit of wheat in there and then get the white. And I'm not real accurate because with bread it's all done kind of by feel, at least for me. So there's 1 cup, 2 cups, and 3 cups. Now this is what I start with, and I'll show you when I go how I add some based on what it feels like. It's something my mom taught me many years ago when I was trying to learn how to make bread and just wasn't very successful at it. So especially kneading bread or kneading any kind of yeast bread type thing. And she would always tell me, you got to knead it till it feels right. Well, what does feel right look like? Well, I finally went to my mom's house and she had me knead the bread, and she would knead it. She'd say, there, that feels right. So I got a sense of a touch of it. This is essentially a no-knead recipe that I've actually do a little bit of kneading with. So I did 3 cups of flour, roughly 3/4 of a cup of whole wheat, the rest white. And then I use 1.5 teaspoons of salt. So there's 1 teaspoon, and there's another 1/2 teaspoon. Okay, and then 1 tablespoon of sugar. And that's a little bit for taste, but primarily to boost the flour or the yeast, because we don't use a lot of yeast in this. It's really about 1/4 teaspoon since it sits overnight. So once that's in there, and I can show you what that looks like. Once that's in there, then I just mix that up slightly before adding my yeast. Salt in a bread flour excuse me, slows down the production or the yeast activity. It balances it out. So if you actually get yeast and salt together, it could kill the yeast. So let me grab my yeast. I buy a big container of yeast from Costco and just keep it in the fridge, and it lasts forever, refrigerated. So roughly 1/4 teaspoon. I'm a little generous with it, kind of a heaping 1/4 teaspoon, and then I mix that in dry. So that's all set. Let me put my yeast back, and I get my water. Now what you want to use is a little bit of warm water. I had boiled some water earlier for coffee, and this is probably still too hot, so I'm just going to use a little bit of the water from the tea kettle and then add some from the tap. And it's 1 2/3 of a cup of water. And really you want it warm, not hot, just warm to the touch. You can use just room temperature water, but the warmer water helps activate the yeast a little bit. So that's 1 2/3 of a cup, and I pour that in, and then just mix it up until it's combined. And this is going to be a relatively loose dough. Now if you want, once this is combined, you can just cover this with saran wrap and let it go, and then when you're ready to bake it, kind of scoop it out onto a piece of parchment paper, but you let it rise for 12 to 18 hours on the counter. And you can see that this, I'll pick this up so you can see, this is kind of a loose, very loose dough. See how loose that is? You can just go ahead and let that rest for 12 to 18 hours before doing a little bit of shaping and then baking it. But what I've experimented with this, and I make it so it's kind of like a, it's called no knead, but I do knead it. So what I do is I grab some flour and sprinkle it over top, and then try to gather it up. Get the spoon out of here. Kind of gather up the dough and turn it on itself a couple of times. And I keep adding little handfuls of dough. It's still pretty loose, it's sticking to my fingers quite a bit, so I keep adding little handfuls and working that dough or that flour into the dough. And I pick the dough up and let it stretch. And I keep adding little handfuls of dough, a little at a, or little handfuls of flour, a little at a time, grabbing the dough gently and lifting it. And I keep adding little handfuls until the dough is resistant to stretching when I lift it up. This is still pretty sloppy, so I'm going to keep adding a little bit of flour to it. And sometimes you have to kind of like scrape the flour off the sides of the bowl. This one needs still just a little more flour. So as I said, I start out with like 3 cups of flour, but I keep adding some and lifting the dough, letting it stretch under its own weight until it resists stretching. Once it starts to resist stretching, then I know it's ready. Now this is, in a way, kind of a kneading technique based on something called the French fold, which I'll show you later. I think that's just about right. Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, see now this is really, let's see if you can see this again. I'm going to get my phone all floury. So you can see how I lift it, and it just slowly stretches. That's about the consistency that you want. So you can see it just kind of very slowly stretches. Once it does that, I just kind of push it down into just kind of pat it down into the bowl, and then I'll cover that with saran wrap. Actually, I have a silicone cover that I'm going to use rather than saran. And that'll just keep, this is a really nice silicone cover that you can use to cover bowls. It kind of sticks a little bit to the bowl, and I'll just set that aside. Now that dough will sit for 12 to 18 hours on the counter. In the wintertime, what I sometimes do, because it's so cold in our house, my oven has a bread proofing setting, so I'll turn that on briefly and then turn it off, and then stick that bowl in the oven overnight, and it's just a little bit of warmth compared to the ambient temperature within the house, and then pull it out. So that's how you start the dough, and again that rests for 12 to 18 hours. Here's another one that I started probably, let's see, it's about 9:30 right now. And I think I put this together about 7. This has been about 14 hours of rising. When I put this in this bowl, it was probably that high. So that's risen overnight. Usually I go a full 18 hours, but for the purposes of this, then this has got a good rise on it. You can kind of see what the dough looks like. It's very airy. You can see lots of bubbles in there. That's a nice rise. And it's still a little loose. So what I'm going to do is get out a rubber spatula. So again, this has gone 14 hours. And first you take a little bit of flour and lightly dust your counter or whatever surface you're working on. You don't want a lot. And then dip your spatula in to flour and kind of gently scrape that out onto the counter. Kind of see how stretchy that is. As I said, normally the regular recipe, the no knead part, you could take this and shape it a little bit and put it on a piece of parchment paper to let it rise for about 2 hours before baking. But I liked my bread to have more form and shape to it. And in order to do that, you got to build the surface strength up. And so what I've experimented with, is doing something called a French fold. And so you grab your dough, just pull it up on itself and fold it over, rotate it 90 degrees, and do the same thing. And I do this maybe half a dozen times. It's just kind of letting gravity pull it and folding it on itself until it really doesn't want to fold anymore. So you can see this is already developing kind of a surface tension. It doesn't really want to pull apart anymore. So once that happens, I let that just sit on the counter like that for about 5 minutes. And then I'll pause this and we'll be right back. Okay, it's rested 5 minutes, and now I'm going to take and do the same thing again. It's got a nice surface on it, but just through experimentation I've found that if I do a little stretching just a couple more times, you don't want to overwork it. If you overwork it, you collapse all the air that's built up. And then see how high that is? See how that's taking its form? Without doing this, it would just tend to want to spread out and not build up. So I'm going to let that rest for another 10 minutes and we'll be right back. Okay, the dough has rested for another 10 minutes, or a total of 15 minutes. And let me bring this in so you can see. Just take a look at that surface, how kind of stretchy it looks and firm. And it's not tacky at all. I mean, I can touch this and my hands don't stick to it. That's what you want the dough to be like. So now I'm going to take something called a bench scraper. I'm going to dust it a little bit. And if you noticed in the video earlier, there's no flour left on the counter. So I just want the surface of my bench scraper and my hand to be a little bit of flour, have a little flour in it. And then I'm going to take it and pull it towards me, which this is adding some more surface tension. Kind of using a circular motion, and I'm trying to build up more surface tension in the dough. You can kind of see that it's starting to form more into a ball. And what this is doing is it's sticking to the counter a little bit, and as I'm pulling it towards me, it's wrapping the dough around itself. So it's creating more surface tension in the top of the dough. Once it really seems to be holding its shape, and occasionally you'll see like a bubble, air bubble, you want to pinch that and let that escape if you see any air bubbles on the surface. So I'm pulling this. I'm going to pull this closer to you. And I'm continuing to pull that and it's doing a good job of holding its shape. So you can kind of see it's a ball. So now I have a cookie sheet with a piece of parchment, and I've lightly dusted the surface with flour. So now I'm just going to pull this dough up with my scraper and place it on there. And you can kind of see how nice and round it is. It's got a very nice surface on it. I'm going to pop a couple more bubbles that have shown up on the surface. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is lightly dust this, or actually kind of heavily dust this with flour. So just take a little bit of flour and you're kind of throwing it on there, covering the whole surface. If there's too much, you can use your hands to spread it around a little bit. Okay, but don't push down on the dough at this point. And now I'm going to take the basting brush, and I'm going to take the extra flour off the parchment, because I don't really want that on my dough. In fact, if you have too much on your dough, if you think it's too heavy, you can lightly brush the dough. So you can kind of see that. Let me bring this in close so you can see that. So that's lightly dusted on the parchment paper. So now I'm going to take some plastic wrap. I use plastic wrap. You can also take like a very lightweight cotton towel. But if you use a cotton towel, make sure you flour the towel itself really well, so that the dough doesn't stick to it. So then just loosely put that over top of there, and I'm going to set this aside. So now what happens is this is going to rise for 2 hours. Now in my oven, I'm going to place a Dutch oven with a lid. You can use any kind of oven-safe vessel, but you want something that's probably on the heavy side that will retain heat, and with a cover that is oven safe. So I'm going to place that in my oven, and in an hour and a half, I'm going to have the oven turn on at 425 with the Dutch oven in it. So this is going to rise for 2 hours. The Dutch oven is going to be in the oven, and in an hour and a half, I'm going to turn the oven on, and this Dutch oven is going to preheat in the oven for 30 minutes before I actually bake my bread. So we'll come back in 2 hours, and I'll show you what happens next. Well, there you should be able to see how much this dough has risen. So I'm just going to uncover it. Oh, I'll be right back. Sorry, I forgot something. Laurel and I like sesame seeds. So this is completely optional, but to get sesame seeds to stick, I'm going to spray this, mist this very lightly with just water. This is just a container I have with water. The moisture also helps when it's put into the Dutch oven to develop a nice crispy crust. So I sprinkle a little bit of sesame seeds on here, and gently just kind of pat them in. It's okay if there's extra on the paper when I go to put the loaf into the oven. It'll be fine. Now I also have a something called a lame, which is just a device that holds a razor from an old safety razor, if you're familiar with those. And you can use just a sharp knife if you want. This is totally optional. You can just let it crack freeform. But I'm going to make a slice in here, and what that will do is, as the dough rises quickly in the oven, it will give it space to go. Now, if you don't do it, it'll just crack naturally and create its own, but I like to give it a quick slice. So you just take a lame or a razor blade or an extremely sharp knife, and I'm just cutting around the edge. You can do different patterns. Sometimes I do a cross, but today I'm doing that circle. So I'm going to get the Dutch oven out of the oven and put this in with the parchment paper, and I'll see if I can move this so you can see me over at the oven. All right. Don't have a professional thing going on here. So I'm going to pull the Dutch oven out of the oven. I'm going to get my bread over here. Now this has been in the oven for about 30 minutes at 425 because I preheated it in there. So that's quite hot. Take the lid off. Carefully pick up the dough with the parchment paper. I like to use parchment paper because it just makes the transfer a lot easier. You don't need to use it. You can be very gentle and just pick up the dough with your hands and pop it into the Dutch oven. So I've got that in the Dutch oven, and now I'm going to put the lid back on, and it's going to go in the oven at 425 for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, I will take the lid off. Let me put my timer on for 30 minutes. So after 30 minutes, I take the lid off, and it stays in the oven about another 15 more minutes, and then take it out of the oven and put it on a rack to cool. So there you go. I will pause it here, and then when the bread is ready to have the lid taken off, I'll take that off so that you can take a look at what it looks like, and then do the final product. See you in 30 minutes. Well, it's only been a few minutes that it's been in the oven, but I forgot to mention that the reason that I'm baking it in a Dutch oven is professional bread ovens actually have humidity control, and bread gets that nice glazed, crispy crust when the humidity is high in the oven. Now, a standard oven isn't really going to have that. So one way is to bake your bread in a Dutch oven, which holds in all the moisture that's baking off of the dough, and creates a humid environment for you to get that nice crispy crust. If you don't have a Dutch oven or a pan that is oven safe, you can also put a pan of boiling water in the oven beneath your on the rack beneath your bread, and that will also provide a humid environment. I've also experimented with using a water sprayer and spraying the inside of the oven just before you put the bread in. But the Dutch oven works the best if you get it. If you have a professional bread oven, great. But I'll see you when I'm ready to take the lid off. Okay, here we are at about 30 minutes into the bake, and I'm going to take the lid off. And I'll bring this around so you can see what that loaf looks like. It's got a nice oven spring, but it's still light, so it's got to go back in the oven another 15 minutes or so. When it's done, I'll come back. Okay, it's been about 15 minutes with the lid off, so now it's time to take the bread out of the oven. Shut the oven off. I have forgotten to do that in the past. There it comes out. And I bang it a little bit on the counter to try to get some of the yeast seeds off, but there is the finished product. And you can see the oven spring. This is about where I made the slice, and this opened up to here in the baking. Now, one of the things you can do to enhance oven spring is to cool your dough just a little bit before you put it in initially. I put mine outside. It's about 22 degrees outside, so I just put it out for a couple of minutes. Just cools down the dough, which helps the yeast to live a little longer while it's in the oven, when it's initially in the oven, and it gives it oven spring, they call it. It just kind of bursts up. So that's the finished product. Any questions? Just post them in the comments and I'll be glad to answer them. One other thing, you should let the dough or the bread cool pretty close to room temperature before you begin slicing it. If you try to slice it when it's hot, the dough will tear. So you can wait. You can slice it after it's cooled down a little bit so it's still warm, but don't slice it as hard as it is. Don't slice it until it's cooled off a little bit.